Hello everyone, good evening for those of you joining. My name's Jane Rendell. I'm very happy to be reading tonight's Bedtime Stories as part of the Architecture Foundation's series curated by Alicia Pivaro. Thank you, Alicia, for inviting me, and thanks to the Architecture Foundation for hosting this. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm based at the Bartlett School of Architecture, where I'm Professor of Critical Spatial Practice. And as I mentioned a few weeks ago, when I was reading my first bedtime story, which was from Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands, much of my own work as a feminist architectural theorist and art critic and site writer engages in the relationship between interior life and the exterior world, and especially the relation between life and work, specifically the genre of life writing. So I've been particularly struck in the last few weeks teaching and participating in university work, as I'm sure many others have, and in practice on how online everything is in this time of COVID, and how the life conditions that usually are in the background have come right into the fore. And those life conditions, which are our support systems that make it possible for us to work, won't allow themselves to be pushed away anymore as unprofessional. So they've entered the foreground. So it made sense for me to read tonight from a book that directly engages with this work-life overlap, but it does it through art practice. So it's a book I've had for some time and often dipped into, but reading from it tonight really encouraged me to go and look at it in more detail. So some of you may know it. Kirsty, The Artist's House, From Workplace to Artwork, and it was published by Sternberg Press in 2013. So I'm going to start right at the beginning of the book, and then throughout the session I'll be dipping into different parts of it. So the introduction: home, where the story of our lives takes place. A request to visit an artist's home is a more delicate matter than asking to do a studio visit. What's on view in the house may be more intimate or more revealing, may offer more glimpses into the personal than what you see when visiting an artist in his or her studio, that is, a space dedicated to the production of work. A lived-in house is animated by assorted daylight practicalities, the tasks and furnishings associated with eating, cleaning and sleeping, revolving arrangements of domestic clutter, the comings and goings of friends, lovers, children and relatives, or the intricate rituals of the solitary dweller. We're here, where the story of our lives takes place, nowhere else, writes Marguerite Duras in her 1987 essay, House and Home. Though the subject of this book is artistic production, my focus is not the artist's studio, that predestined space defined by its singular purpose of creation, but rather the home with all its extraneous contingencies. It does not take the house as an architectural structure per se, but as a boundary between the world at large and the private centre, as a container for the everyday and as an activated environment. The following chapters aim to examine artists' work through this environment where private and public fold into each other. The conflation of life and work in the domestic realm presupposes a realism like that exemplified by George Perec's incisive writings on the uses of space and everyday experience. Rather than dwell on the extraordinary events that the media presents us with, he asks us to question the banal, the quotidian, the obvious, the common, the ordinary, the infraordinary, the background noise, the habitual. In the home, the infraordinary is all around. It perhaps even constitutes the home. Perec encourages us to analyse the repetitive rhythms of the everyday. We live, true. We breathe, true. We walk, we open doors. We go down staircases. We sit at a table in order to eat. We lie down on a bed in order to sleep. How, where, when, why? With a botanist's attention to detail, he describes the work table in his Parisian apartment, making an inventory of all the different objects on it and their bearing on the work that occurs there, as if hoping to discover the answer to his questions. This inventory, or history, writes Perec, offers a somewhat oblique approach to my daily practice, a way of talking about my work, about my history and my preoccupations, an attempt to grasp something pertaining to my experience, not at the level of its remote reflections, but at the very point where it emerges. It's exactly this possibility of grasping experience where it emerges that's available in the home as workplace. The shift of focus and scale that the domestic interior affords lets the personal, the intimate, or the peripheral become the locus of meaning rather than exterior events or public occurrences. So this interesting exposure of private life made public and the layering of what's being said with where it is being said from perhaps first really hit me when I was listening to a lecture from Ed Snowden, delivered from his Moscow apartment. Ed delivered a typically erudite discussion of how unwanted surveillance invades our intimate lives via the camera of our mobile phones, just facing me right now, with his headphones and mic set against the backdrop of a rather chintzy floral living room. The whistleblower acts to make a disclosure, to make a matter of concern, often a confidential document being kept secret, available to the public. Ed's public persona is modelled out of these intimate private backdrops, hotel room, not his own, at least not yet. It made me think of the wonderful book by the literary critic Diana Fuss, The Sense of an Interior, 4 Rooms and the Writers That Shaped Them, or actually one could rework the subtitle to 4 Writers and the Rooms That Shaped Them. So Emily Dickinson, Sigmund Freud, Helen Keller and Marcel Proust. Fuss examines the relationship between the writer's work and the spaces where they write. Various architectural elements crop up: doors, windows, walls, and pieces of furniture, beds and chairs. But the table is perhaps key. It's certainly the case in Freud's office because of the way he surrounded himself when working with a collection of objects, all of which told stories to him. And some might know the really fascinating map that was drawn by the artist Daniel Sperry in his anecdoted topography of chance, which has 80 objects on a table in a hotel where he was living, and he drew around all of them at exactly on the 17th of October 1961 at 3:47 p.m. So Sperry assigned each object a number and then wrote a brief description of the object and the memories or associations it evoked. So the table seems an element most appropriate to our Zoom room work lives right now. Some are lucky enough to have a table of their own, while others must share. Working partners doing simultaneous Skype tutorials, one on each side of a table, or family member participating in MS Teams committee work while other families eat lunch. It's going on all around us. So that made me think of reading from chapter 2, but all the other chapters have really great titles. There's Unmade Beds, Dwelling in Dream Space, Doors and Windows Towards the Total Interior, Outside Walls, The House of Sculpture, and so on. It's a really wonderful book. I'm going to read a little bit now from The Kitchen Table, The House as Workshop. What happens to a house when its rooms are repurposed and furniture is used in unfamiliar ways? When cutlery and crockery are pushed off the table to make way for notebooks, diaries and drawing paper, and the kitchen becomes a studio? Does the home turn back into the kind of workshop that it once was? The workshop is the craftsman's home, writes sociologist Richard Sennett. In the Middle Ages, craftsmen slept, ate and raised their children in the places where they worked. This was several centuries before the siphoning off of work to a separate physical location and the resultant creation of the home as an independent entity. Domesticity, privacy and comfort had not yet been invented as the functions of the home. In Home, A Short History of an Idea, architectural theorist Witold Rybinski discusses Albrecht Dürer's well-known 1514 engraving, St. Jerome in his study. Try and do a little close-up there of St. Jerome in his study, which I'm sure many of you know well. Hopefully it's a little bit in focus. Otherwise, perhaps you can conjure it up from your mental memory archive. So, personal possessions, a chair, a desk, a place to write. Not much has changed in over 400 years, he writes. Or has it? He goes on to elaborate on the fact that Dürer's study was actually a room with many uses, all of them public. At noon, the writing stand was put away and the householders sat around the table and had their meal. In the evening, the table was taken apart and the long bench became a settee. At night, what now served as a living room was turned into a bedroom. The singular functions of different rooms and accordant furnishings, as Georges Perec iterates. A bedroom is a room in which there is a bed. A dining room is a room in which there are a table and chairs, and often a sideboard. A sitting room is a room in which there are armchairs and a couch, and so on. This was a luxury not yet conceived of. Does the artist's alteration of the function of rooms and their furnishings suggest a return to the multifunctional notion of the workshop? Felix González Torres' self-identification as a kitchen table artist should not be taken literally to suggest that the table in the kitchen was the sole place in which he made his work. It means rather that he worked where he could, when he could, which mostly happened to be his home. When I first started making art in 1987, I had no money, González Torres said in an interview with the artist Ross Blettner in 1995. I had a tiny little studio, smaller than this kitchen, a studio apartment. People would say, "Can I come to the studio?" And I'd say, "Sure, but my studio is underneath my bed." I had one of those ugly captain's beds with drawers. Everything I made had to fit under that bed. Like Dürer's multifunctional study, for González Torres, the dinner table became the desk and the bed became the closet. Production at home imposes a number of limitations, some of which are physical, such as scale, storage, materials and methods, and others are psychological. The home is rarely as private as the studio, the artist's usually solitary and self-designated place of work, but must accommodate not only the artist himself or herself, but also family members, lovers, visiting friends or dinner guests. One of González Torres' maxims was, "Your limitations should be your strengths." For him, as many other artists considered here, the limited scale and porosity of the home as workplace created a set of parameters that could be generative in themselves. And returning to Georges Perec a little bit further on. So Perec's inventory in notes concerning the objects that are on my work table can be read like a geographical map to determine the working stage at which he is. I tidy my work table quite frequently, he says. This rearrangement of my territory rarely takes place at random. It most often corresponds to the beginning or end of a specific piece of work. It intervenes in the middle of those indecisive days when I don't quite know whether I'm going to get started and whether I simply cling to those activities, and we all know them, of withdrawal, tidying, sorting, setting in order. Once the work is in progress, however, my work table becomes cluttered with objects. This housekeeping tendency, miniaturized to the scale of the work table in Perec's apartment, is like a mental microcosm of the minor, repetitive activities of maintenance that keep a home running smoothly. Turning, as Marguerite Duras writes, discontinuity into a silent and unobtrusive continuity. And moving a little bit further along in the chapter, talking now of another group of artists. With the conflation of home and workspace comes the infiltration of daily routines into working practices. Donald Judd's rational ordering of artwork-like furniture, or furniture-like artworks in his New York City industrial live-work building is a case in point. Everything was arranged precisely in what he called a permanent installation. Rather than making a chair to sleep in or a machine to live in, it's better to make a bed, he wrote. A straight chair is best for eating or writing. The third position is standing. An even more radical analysis of life's practical needs was undertaken by the artist Absalon, whose cellules from 1991 to 2 compressed everything needed for sleeping, sitting, eating and washing into single units, all painted white. His 6 prototypes, each cast a different geometric shape, were meant to be sited in 6 different cities across the world for his own use. His untimely death in 1993, at the age of 28, did not allow for the project to be fully realised, and the cellules remain utopian proposals rather than working modules. And again, I'll try and share the image if I can. I don't know, I had the chance to see one of these in an exhibition in Berlin a few years ago, and really exquisite works. Photo doesn't really do it justice. Andrea Zittel's undertaking has a similar conceptual underpinning to Absalon's, one based on a rigorous and ongoing analysis of the intricate routines of life. Though much of her production of furniture-like or even architectural structures occurs outside of the home in a dedicated studio, the home and what takes place within it are its genesis. Her work may not be made at the kitchen table, but the table itself is highly likely to be one of her designs, devised to solve a particular practical problem. For Zittel, work at home becomes work about home. Of all the artists looked at closely in this chapter, Louise Bourgeois is perhaps the most literal kitchen table artist. The various houses in which she lived in New York were a locus of production since she arrived from Paris in 1938. Furthermore, the homes remembered from her childhood figure in many of her works, although she had a separate industrial-scale studio in which she made large-scale sculptures from 1980 until 2005. She continued the drawing and diary keeping that were vital to her home-based practice. In the late 1990s, she began to spend less and less time in her studio, until finally, in the last decade of her working life, her kitchen table became the absolute centre of her production. So at this point, I'd really like to draw out the feminist aspect of this kind of work and remind us of a couple of projects by women architects that feature tables. You may have some favourites of your own, but you might be familiar with Sarah Wigglesworth's by now pretty famous series of plan drawings of a table, where the first drawing shows the table pristinely set, awaiting its diners. The second is pictured in the midst of a rather lively meal. And then finally, the final drawing shows a mess of a table, abandoned with all the food and drink consumed. You might know Muff's competition design entry for a women's museum. It's section based on the table as the point at which home and work life intersect. And some of the writing that I mentioned in the last Bedtime Stories I did from the work of Anzaldúa were published by a press, the Kitchen Table Press, Women of Colour Press, in the 1980s. And the kitchen and dining table featured in the US feminist art project, some of you may know, called Woman House from 1972, a feminist art installation and performance space organised by Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro. And of course, the dining table became front and centre of Chicago's iconic dinner party work from 1979. So I want to focus in a little bit now and read a final extract from this chapter and from the book concerning specifically the work of Louise Bourgeois and in particular her Femme Maison series. So I'm going to just share this with you if I can. I hope you can see it. I think it's a very COVID-ish image, to be honest. So I'll just read a little bit about this work. The psychological interrelation of body and built space was already apparent in the first works Bourgeois made upon arriving in New York. Newly married, she and Goldwater, who was returning to teach at New York's University's Institute of Fine Arts, moved from Paris in 1938. In these well-known works, titled Femme Maison, a house replaced the head or torso of a female body, while arms sprouted from the upper stories or a plume of smoke emerged from the roof like a long ponytail. Woman and house, body and architecture fused into a claustrophobically literal conception of the term housewife. Is the house a hiding place or a prison, shelter or prosthesis? Is the woman supporting the building or being crushed by it? Is she inside the house or is she the house? The apparently smooth fusion between female body and architecture was fraught with anxiety. It was not as literal as it looked. The house continued to figure in Bourgeois' work as a metaphoric form, receptacle of memory and place of production. The constant return to leitmotifs of her own biography ran like a thread through her 60 years of artistic production, and these memories were often housed in the domestic arena. The house was a site of emotional conflict, as demonstrated by the many anecdotes Bourgeois related in her lifetime about the ménage à trois between her father, mother, and English governess that took place in her childhood home. It was, however, also a source of stability. A diary entry from March 27, 1982 reads, "I love my routine, my work, my house, my clothes." Routine, work, home and clothing are what give structure, internal and external, to the days of a life. So the Femme Maison are a series of paintings Bourgeois made from 1946 to 7 that addressed the relation between female subjectivity and architecture. In these paintings, the heads and bodies of nude female figures are replaced by architectural forms such as buildings and houses. And Femme Maison translates from the French as housewife, or perhaps more literally, woman house. One is caught wondering if architecture is a form of protection or safety for the female subject, or perhaps a trap or place of danger. Throughout the COVID period, there have been serious concerns with the domestic abuse of women, as well as men and children, I have no doubt, but also some interesting observations on the gendering of household tasks undertaken during the lockdown, with suggestions that in many heterosexual families, women are tending to take up more of the home care activities as they once did, and often still do, as well as the way in which inequalities of housing have been highlighted in the need to stay home, where it becomes obvious that home as a safe and stable site is a place of privilege that many have no access to. I'd like to end now by reading a writing that tells of the merging of body and architecture during the lockdown, and so for me, it's a COVID take on Femme Maison. Since January, along with artist Polly Gold and urbanist David Roberts, I've been teaching a site writing module for students at the Bartlett, taking the MA in Architectural History, the MA Historic Urban Environments and the MA Situated Practice. Through a series of seminars and workshops, participants each create what we call a site writing, a work of architectural theory in which they engage with the sites and situations from which they write. These past weeks have been super disrupted, first by union staff, of which I am one, needing to take strike action over a 4-week period in defence of pensions, wages, gender and race pay gaps and the conditions of precarious workers in the HE sector. The strike then overlapped with the university buildings closing due to COVID, and the students were scattered back to their home sites across the globe, some to anonymous places of quarantine, often under heavy surveillance, others finding themselves back in their childhood bedrooms, and yet others were holed up in fast emptying London student halls. It's been a tough time. But I've been amazed and delighted by the writing that's been produced by them all out of these unexpected difficulties. I really wish I could read from all the beautiful texts, but my time is short, so I'm going to just read a snippet from a work called Homekeeping by the writer Honor Vincent, who's currently completing her MA in Architectural History. And if you're interested in reading the whole range of work from the cohort, we're looking to exhibit it online later in the year, so do check out my site writing website for details. So let's just end this evening's bedtime stories with Honor's words. When I first wake, the darkness has only just lifted, I close my eyes and wonder whether they were really open to begin with. Sometime later, perhaps, my eyes open ajar, halfly through my lashes, again or for the first time. The flat is coming to dawn. The wall, whose voices slip back to a whisper in the cold hours, warms itself to a hum, faltering a little as it wakes like the tuning of a radio. The bookshelves grow amber and the chest of drawers picks up its dusty scent. Essences arrange themselves. I feel something in the room shift. There's a stirring of sorts. It's hard to say which sense feels this, but I'm aware it's happening. The sense of it wakes me up. Without opening my eyes fully, I rise into my body. The walls lean back to accommodate. So, beautiful piece of writing. Thank you so much, Honor, for letting me read it. And thank you all for listening. It's been great. I've really enjoyed delving into that beautiful book, The Artist's House, and I would recommend it to anyone who's interested in thinking creatively about how we work from home in these COVID times. Have a great rest of your evening and take care. Bye.